Here he is, the man, the myth. How you going, mate?
Hey there, David. Thanks for having me. I'm good.
Round two, but just for all our listeners, this is a second attempt at the title. We had a crack the first time, but due to some technical issues, we're back in the ring. We're gonna have another roll at this.
Same as when I was 13-year-old, I'll just blame the internet.
Yeah, it's very fitting. Everyone else does when it suits them as well. It's the
Yeah,
go-to
right.
move, isn't it?
So,
If in
David,
doubt, blame out.
I'm having my morning coffee over here in the Netherlands. Over there, you're in Australia. It's like way past evening time, right?
Yeah, 6:44 p.m. So it's not too bad.
Damn.
Still gentleman's hours on my end.
Are we gonna introduce each other or what?
Yeah, let's do this. So Marijan Marcus, a good friend of mine, we've been playing in the same circles on LinkedIn for some time now. We kind of got caught up in each other's networks, and although we talk about very, very different things, we I don't know. I think you and I have we've had some good, robust conversations, some good jabs as well, some good yes, some good jabs at each other's hypotheses, so to speak, and we keep each other very honest. But I think in turn, over time, we've developed a fair bit of respect for each other. So I asked Marijan if he would be so kind as to donate some of his time in order to explore some topics, predominantly around messaging. And then I wanted to open up into his strength, which was an interesting viewpoint on the Ukraine crisis. So we're going to do kind of two parts to this. Marijan, thank you very much. I was very excited to talk again.
But first, I have to introduce you, Mr. David Neal, whom I've encountered many years before on this beautiful algorithm we call LinkedIn, where you were one of the top voices or something of 2020, 2021, something. This is life
Oh,
goal stuff you tell your mom, right?
yeah, that's what I wake up every morning going, please,
So
can I be a LinkedIn top 20 voice? It was last year. It was last year, but
this is
we
the hustle.
made a
We all
success.
want to be influencers these days. We're not getting old or anything. But I know you as I think you're a consultant nowadays. But I know you're a military man. You were your youth sports guy, and you have great content centered on leadership. And I
Yes, yeah,
think
it's most of our
that is
effort.
your main topic, and that's what platonically attracted me to you on the internet. Finding your great content on human leadership, how to deal with groups, how to run teams, which I learned from, and then started shit posting upon, because that's how you become best friends online, right?
Of course, it's the only way to become best friends, mate. There has to be a storm. It's one of the stages of team development. It has to go that way.
That's the beauty of the internet in itself. My best friends from Brazil, from Japan, from Ukraine, from Ghana, we became friends because we started, making really bad and awkward jokes about each other's nationalities and such, and start shit talking. And from there, we became best friends.
It's the only way to become best friends. Otherwise, you're just acquaintances.
Most likely. But now we're acquaintances who are doing a podcast.
With cool NATO cups, which don't say NATO.
NAFO, of course. The most effective grassroots anti-misinformation campaign in human history. More on that later.
All right, great. Well, that's a good little segue onto our first topic, which is messaging. So, when we first talked about this, we dove into a couple of topics, and one of them that emerged, and I want to hit it again, and I dare say we'll end up in a different place than when we first talked about it, is around this concept of the distinction between trying to be right versus trying to be correct. And I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are on this, noting your unique position on data, and to maybe nudge it just a little bit further down the path is that distinction between information and data. And correct me if I'm wrong on the terminology, but at least from my old world, information was always geared towards decision making. So we were collecting very, very specific data under the guise of information, to filtering down and down in order to be able to yay or nay a certain decision. And those decisions would then be ranked in a priority order, and that would be our plan, so to speak. Is that a fair snapshot?
I've heard so much worse snapshots, Dave. You did pretty well. So,
okay, cool.
As a social scientist and data scientist nowadays, who started out with statistics to model crime, pandemics, electoral outcomes, and it was statistics. It was not sexy at all. Now we call it all AI and algorithms. Now I'm sexy, but I'm still doing the same damn thing. From that perspective, we look at data, yes, as a tool, as something we use to derive information from to support decision making. This is why Google itself stopped calling it data scientists, but decision scientists. Because the stuff we do helps people make decisions, be it for farmers in Kenya and India on when to harvest, for large government organizations to assess how many beds they're going to need, clinically, how much patients are you expecting, to simply, is this a dog, yes or not, should I open the door for it? No, all of that is data-driven decision making. Now, that leads us to the whole being right versus being correct, because I have had many points in my career as a consultant where I was totally correct, but they didn't want me to be right. I'm going to use a bad example from very early in my career when I was modeling and forecasting attrition for a large company. And I found that one of the biggest source of attrition, so of people leaving and of burnouts, because social scientist, was not the pizza parties or the working from home conditions, which is usually what HR thinks matters most, to the people. Not the foosball tables either, or the ping pong tables, but the manager, because you don't leave a company, you leave your boss. So I found in my 3-4 years of data that it was mainly 4 managers that were causing a significant portion of attrition and of burnout, of dropping. And if a computer says, you're going to get a burnout, they're going to get angry at you. But if I build a model that's interpretable, where I can explain because of this and this and this factor, you are at risk, then suddenly I'm just explaining and using information. And it's not scary anymore. It's not AI anymore. And sales can't call it any AI anymore. But I very distinctively remember presenting my findings to this organization who had this problem to senior management. And I said, look, it's these 4 managers that are causing the attrition. And they were in the audience.
Brilliant.
So you can guess what happened next. Yeah, you're laughing. I wasn't laughing. I was young back then, damn it. So
and
they
rebellious and free.
They get angry at me, of course, because anger is the anger and denial is the first state of grief. So they said that my whole research was shit, was probably bad, probably also racist, and biased, because algorithms are dangerous and we shouldn't believe it. Really, where they were signing their own confession, because senior management also saw them act up and later on fired, I think, 2 of the guys. But at that point in time, I was the kid taking the bullet. Because the organization basically already knew this. They just needed somebody external, somebody independent to prove it, and then be the messenger that gets shot. So I was very much correct at that point. I did not mess up my data, but oh boy, they didn't want me to admit I was right. I love being right. This is why I'm a data scientist.
Well, from the human perspective, it reminds me of something my dad once said. Shame a person and you'll have an enemy for life. And, to superimpose another concept over the top of that is rationalization, that little voice inside your head, particularly from the conscious mind, that has absolutely no limits. And it most definitely is geared towards self-protection. And so coming into that environment,
all night.
anyone can rationalize anything. And And what's the scariest type of person is the person that says that'll never happen to me, because they're the ones that end up doing all the messed up stuff in the world, frankly. Nah, it would never happen to me. I'm different. No, you're not. You're not different. You're not you're not above the rules, and you are as prone, if not more prone, because of your naivety and more to your point before, the denial. Those people will have a fear response. It's like a fight, flight, or freeze, a cortisol-induced fear response, and the implications of that can be pretty dire. And people will do completely irrational things, which is the irony, is rationalization, irrational, and then rationale, all different things. People will do incredibly irrational things. And from the outside, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why are they so defensive? All I'm doing is talking about the data. I'm just talking about, this is what the findings were. But in reality, they're going, I'm not going to be able to provide for my kids. You're the threat. Who the hell do you think you are? You're undermining me. And they will attack, or they'll run,
Fight or flight, baby.
Yeah, oh man, and don't underestimate how powerful that is. People would do. If you here's a good one for you. I'll see your eyes light up on this one, I reckon. If you can't figure out why someone's doing something from a values perspective, like from a values or principles or morals perspective, switch it. Go to the dark side. Run the fear model. What fears do they have? And if you're talking to someone and you think you know them well, but you can't articulate their fears at a very individual and subjective level, you do not know that person well enough. Now, there's two types of people. You'll get people who use those fears as a means of manipulation and coercion, and you'll get other types of people who protect the fears, and they develop incredible loyalty as a result of it, because people see this person as part of the cure, and it is, I guess, I think it's a very wanky term personally about psychosocial hazards and whatnot. I think it's just a buzzword. I think this goes far, far earlier and far deeper than that, and I think it goes to inherent fears. And if you can figure out what they are, you can really help people to level up and go to different places. But it sounds like that's a good case study, because you might have been correct. Was it the right way to deliver that information? Maybe not. And maybe you got more fight than you needed.
Little did I know at the time, but I saw your colleague post about this fear conundrum just this morning, or maybe evening from your perspective.
Sure.
On us being driven by fear, which led me to the conclusion that understanding fear can be the opposite of being driven by fear, because most fear we have is irrational. Sometimes it's totally rational. Giant cars heading your way, you should fear that. It's going to trample you. But most of the fear that drives us as humans is irrational to some extent. So
Yes.
Understanding it is the opposite of being controlled and driven by it, because the most intrinsic fear of man is the unknown. And when you're 100%. Being driven by the unknown, then you're in big trouble.
Absolutely. It's also a really good perspective to overlay and superimpose over change management, because people try and and we have to. Our businesses have to evolve. We need to put new technology in. We need to change things. Otherwise, we're just going to get left behind. Put that in. Move it, box that and move it to the side, and we'll just put that as a constant for the purpose of the conversation. Oftentimes we don't give the devil its due, and we don't consider that people have some inherent fears. If you start poking around on their personal boundaries and on their values, and you start prompting a fear response, not only will you have someone who doesn't want the project to succeed, you're going to have someone who actively wants it to fail. And we then start bridging in from the passive space into the active space. And that's a whole nother ball game. And they might put, look, I don't know. It's just, I'm getting there. I'm learning it. And in the behind the scenes, they're sitting there pressing every button they can, pulling out cords, trying to make this thing fail, because no one has explained to them their place in the new system or their new environment. And a good model to run over that is their relevance and their competence. You ever want to calm someone down? You ever really want them to make them feel like they're part of something bigger? Explain their relevance in the story and demonstrate their competence, what they bring unique to the party. And you start seeing that cortisol, amygdala hijack, fear response starting to reduce dramatically, because they're like, oh, I do have a part to play in the new story.
I have to rewind a little bit here because you mentioned this is a big part of change management, and I want to challenge that because I don't think change management exists. Any management is change management, because if nothing is changing, then what the heck is management doing?
I'm gonna come back there. I'm gonna rebuttal.
Yeah, but I also want to talk about the fear response, especially in my field of modern technology, AI algorithms. We see so many known and so many people using the fear response in the worst possible ways. Like, I live in Europe. We have GDPR here. We have a lot of laws entering in about data privacy, data security, bias in algorithms, all big, scary stuff. But we also see that a lot of these irrational fears, because many people do not properly understand data, do not properly understand statistics, let alone machine learning and beyond. So to them, it's magic. To them, it is scary. It is irrational. We use this fear mongering to support choices that we would not otherwise make. Okay. So, for example, I see large organizations who just don't have their data, whatever, in order. Everyone struggles with their IT landscape, let's be honest. Yep. And their data is a mess, data quality, unable to sort that stuff out, unable to properly take that and launch models to do data-driven recruitment, HR, running your core processes, letting alone forecasting what's going to happen. Because everyone wants to do that last step, forecasting the future. But to do that, you need to have proper data of the past. And that's where they messed up. And then we say, yeah, but data privacy is important. And what if, irrational fear, data leaks happen? Sure. Or what if the AI is racist or turns into Terminator evil? And then we start leveraging these irrational fears, because to some extent they are. Sometimes they are very legitimate concerns, don't get me wrong. But a lot of the times when we do not properly understand them, we start using them as, in Dutch, we call this excuustrus. How do I... You're Australian, we can swear here, right?
Go for it, good enough.
So in Dutch, we call this an excuse bitch, which is basically something that is not entirely relevant, but we use it to just say no to something so we don't have to do something. So many organizations who don't have their IT and data or whatever in place to even support rational, informed, data-driven decision-making start using fear-mongering stuff like data privacy, cybersecurity, it's scary, and what if AI goes evil, as excuses to not do the stuff that they should be doing to even fight these issues. I run gender pay gaps models. This is part of what I do as a data scientist. So I try to detect inequality in wages between males, females, different ethnicities, even LGBT. If you know they're gay, give me the data. I can check if you're underrepresenting them. I can measure it. But the only way I cannot do any of that is if I have no data, because somebody down the line said, using the fear-mongering argument, yeah, but what if the model discriminates? And here we actually encounter a very big ethical issue in major organizations, in that we cannot, and we've seen this go wrong with Apple in 2019, for example, where we cannot measure how badly we treat clients, own employees, users, because we do not have the data to check or measure that. Because of these fear-mongering tactics. And that brings me to the final message. sometimes we do not measure stuff on purpose because we don't want to be found out. And that brings me all the way back to standing in front of those managers who were found out, because that was their fear response.
Hey, it's a good point. And one of the, we'll come back to that change management bit thing, by the way. I think that's a good one to come back to. Yeah, but we'll keep pushing forward, because one of the discussions I've had in various circles, and I've actually had to present in quite large groups across a myriad of different industries, is around diversity and gender and whatnot, and insert any other subdivision down, or broad demographic breakdown in here. We've probably talked about it to some extent. Mm-hmm. One of the things that has become obvious to me, I think, if I've landed on the point correctly, is some people have a bias for hunting bias. So they get really good at finding bias, but they also in turn don't recognize they also have a bias for looking for it. Now, I used to be a visual tracker. I used to, one of my weird things I did in the army was roll around and track people. And in order to do that, you have to look at the micro. You're looking at broken twigs and trees and ant nests and whatever, footprints, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, it takes a lot of energy to do that. But while you're looking down, you're not looking anywhere else. And it very much is a case of what you look for is what you find.
Yeah.
Right. And so in this weird twist of irony, I have this gut suspicion that in certain circles, the hunt for bias has indeed developed its own bias. And now it's become something that in many cases is bigger than it actually is in reality. And to your point about data, I don't know. I don't have the data. I don't have the evidence to support it one way or the other. And far-reaching blasé statements are not helpful when you're dealing with individual organizations with their own nuance and their own particular characteristics. What I do know is there is a certain personality type that seems to be emerging out of the rough, which is hunting for bad things and is finding them disproportionately high and represented and then proclaiming them to be truths. And I think there's an inherent danger in that.
This is very simple psychology that goes far beyond the specific bias, ethical diversity issue, which is that any behavior rewarded is behavior that will be repeated, because
our culture is comprised of the behaviors we reward.
A goal in itself, and like this is why we have sales targets. This is why we set goals for organizations. But I, as a data person, I'm very scared of KPIs, because and a master's in policy analysis and big data, because back then everything was big data. Great memes. From a policy analysis point of view, anything not included in the KPI will be discarded and lost to optimize that KPI. So it's never just about what you're measuring, it's also what you're not measuring. Because if we just reward people for one part of their behavior as a professional, then that's the part they'll focus on at the cost of everything else.
Hey, it's a good point. And, and even if you switch back into a neuroscience model, the same truth still applies. At any one time, there's billions of pieces of information competing for your attention. And of that billion, less than half of 1% on a really good optimal day get through. And so to that end, where you draw your attention and what you look for is immediately what you'll start finding, and that's your confirmation bias. And that's also what's not being looked at. And to my mind, that can be actually quite a disconcerting prospect, because what people take to be truths is less truth as it is what has been the central point of focus. Now, there's a whole myriad of other things that are, by definition, are not being prioritized whenever you prioritize. And so what are the things we're not looking at? That's always the thing that draws my attention. So
this is the whole context thing. I'm going to quote a person who has been very important in my life, which is be scared of anyone who says they have the truth, because there is no such thing as one truth. Context is everything. Um, and you live in a self-fulfilling prophecy if you're only looking at part of the data and deriving conclusions from that. I repeat this, as a social scientist, learned models to measure all kinds of discrimination and bias 10 years ago. I feel old now. The models themselves are 20, 30 years ago. So when like 5 years ago, the whole market exploded and we started focusing correctly on these types of issues, but pretending they were anything new or that the focus on it was new, I was like, what? And they were like, yeah, can we measure this bias? How would we do it? And I'm like, there's papers on this stuff from 15 years ago. So I start digging up really old papers from 15 years ago, and we start applying these, and we start measuring aforementioned gender pay gaps. We start measuring attrition. We start measuring burnout rates, which is nothing new. But within the context of organizations who suddenly care about these, it is new. Not to science, where I once upon a time was from, because a data scientist applies scientific methods to solve data problems. And I'm like, yay, this means my job actually has meaning. Dad, see, I did get a job in computers. Yay. So then suddenly sustainability and environmentalism becomes a thing. And I'm once again like, what is this shit? We've been doing this for years. I do a lot of NGO work. I work with NGOs in Kenya and Tanzania, in India, to help forecast for smallholder farmers what their yield will be, how much fertilizer they need to use. And suddenly this is all environmentalism and sustainability, and it's great. But I was doing that years before, not because of any buzzword, but because I thought it was important. And now suddenly there's all-out war on my continent, in Europe, in Ukraine, due to the illegal invasion by Russia. And one of my online friends, like I know you online, I used to call him Eastern European bastard. He calls me Western European bastard. This is how we became friends.
Good dialogue. But at least it's dialogue. It's good dialogue.
Then he sent me a message saying I'm not going to be online much. I'm joining the army. And I haven't heard from him in 5 months. This is why I think the internet is such an important thing to have. This is how we know people from all over the world. This is why we care, how we care about people from all over the world. And this is an important contributor to the world helping out those in need. Because if we don't know them, we don't care about them, then we let the crimes happen. His name was Sergey, I think, because I only ever knew his online name. And I'm very much obsessed with the war in Ukraine, the war for Ukraine right now, because I have friends there. And that's not because of any buzzword that we suddenly think business ethics or anything are important. I'm doing this because I feel it's important from my context. But I'm sure in a few years, companies will be bragging about it again. That's the damn mechanism.
Mate, well, look, again, run the model that I said before. If you can't measure it through the altruistic lens, which is the values-driven, motivation, goal-based, kind of forward-moving, optimistic lens, go to the dark side for a moment and run the fear. And to that point, the word knee-jerk jumps into my head, where I think a lot of organizations jump on the buzzword of the day, and then they start spooling up and they start pushing very, very quickly towards whatever the new fad is. And it's often at the expense of the old one, by the way. That's a very quick switching of allegiances too. There's very quick to jump to the next new shiny thing.
Which is an issue when the new one depends on the old one. All the AI revolutions of today depend on the IT and data revolutions of yesterday. And those were often not fully implemented. Thus, you're stuck today. It means I'll have work for the rest of my life. So it's all good, But
you're going to be all right.
But this is
people, maybe not so much.
Short-term thinking. We're talking about.
Yeah, well, it speaks to a larger consideration, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. So conceptually, I think there's a distinction between values and beliefs. So values are like a moral North Star, a guiding principle, that gut instinct to help Sergey, from the Eastern Bastard region, right? That's values driven. We normally subscribe them and collect them from our parents or very long enduring relationships, and they're non-contextual. They're principle driven, right? Yeah. Moral North Star is a good way to think about it. Beliefs can and do and should change with the introduction of new information. Right? So they should be constantly evolving and changing and adjusting. I think what if I put my finger on it, I think one of the big problems we have at a societal level across all nations at the moment, due to the unifying effect of the internet, I think is a big part to play in it, but it's not the sole reason, but it's a contributor, a big one, is people have built their teams on common belief systems. And then what happens is new information gets injected through the course of time, as it does, and at varying rates with different individuals at different times in different sequence within that organization or that group. And then the foundation for which that group was built on becomes decimated and the thing crumbles in on itself. Right. So I think the answer is that you want to build teams that are founded on common value systems, but subscribe to the importance of having different beliefs. Because the friction and the chaos and the frustration associated with having differences of opinion based on different beliefs is overshadowed and superseded by the strength of the value system. It's how you arrive at a sentence where
I agree with you fully, but part of this issue is also that people mistake core values for beliefs and the other way around.
Correct. And so now we have this unusual situation that we find ourselves in where we can't say the age-old sentence of "I respect you, even though I don't agree with you." That sentence doesn't exist because respect is the value, but agree is the belief. And now we have people who go, "You disagree with me, therefore you are against me." And then it goes a little bit further, because then it goes, "If you're not with me, then you're against me," which couldn't be further from the truth. Someone not with you is not someone against you. People are living their own life a lot of the time. And to that point we said before, there's a lot of information competing for their attention. And so, some people go a bridge too far and to their own detriment by saying, look, 98% of people don't care about this topic, therefore they're against me. It's like, you can't be fighting 98% of people. And frankly, they're not fighting you. They're just not interested in what you have to say because there's 100 other things that are in their mind of equal importance right now. And that could be as simple as getting the shopping tonight to feed the kids. And so for them, it's a bridge too far to think about A, B, C, D, E, and F, G. And some people are really getting themselves wound up about things they cannot disassociate from. And it's really to their detriment. Teams are getting fractured. Relationships are getting burned. People are, to your word before, getting burnt out because they feel like the world is happening to them. And it's like, man, that simple distinction goes a very long way to solving, I think, at least from maintaining one's own sanity, that it's okay to have a difference of opinion.
I think there's another thing that we mistake for another, which is that uninterested can also never mistake uninterested for uninformed.
Hey, good point.
I entered the data field in 2007-8 with WikiLeaks when Afghanistan and Iraq was happening, and there was all kinds of war crime stuff. And I as a little kid, a minor at the time, was doing all kinds of weird stuff on my old desktop I
can only imagine what you were doing on your desktop.
Using mentions in leaked data from Lady Gaga CDs because that's how Chelsea Manning transported WikiLeaks out, to find evidence of war crimes happening that some big state called the USA denied.
Mm-hmm.
And I still do the same today, except now the war crimes are in HD and a lot more gruesome. And back then daily. I had this feeling of, why does nobody care for it? This shit is happening. Nobody's seeing it. Nobody is caring for it. So I mistook people's misinterest for they actually don't care, but really they were misinformed. But in today's day and age, where because there are so many topics to care about, we want to keep things simple. If you want to keep things simple from a modeling perspective, you make it yes or no. You make it A or B. You make it black or white. But nothing in real life is black and white. It doesn't work like that. Everything is odds. Everything is chances, and everything is highly complex. So to return to your core values versus core values that don't change versus beliefs which change depending on context and that people mistake for one another. I was going somewhere with this. We have the issue that people take interpretations of those core values as being beliefs. And I'm going to quote somewhere here who says, yeah, having principles just means you don't want to think about it. And I don't fully agree with this. But there is a very good point here, which is, yes, if you have principles and you just keep repeating them because you don't want to think about the issue, you don't want to figure out how your core beliefs should manifest and interpret differently in this situation. So I think, I don't know, freedom of speech is important. Hell, I think freedom of speech is very important. But within the context of, I don't know, hate speech, does that mean you should be free to do hate speech, or you should be free to talk about stuff without being hated upon? It can be interpreted in two ways. And not wanting to do this discussion, not wanting to discuss this, because either is fine by me as long as you have a discussion, but not wanting to discuss this and just using the excuse bitch thing again of, yeah, but this is my core value, then you're just using your core values as an excuse not to think and not to debate. And the loss of debate is like the most dangerous thing in democratic society.
It's at the top of the hierarchy. It is at the top of the hierarchy as far as I'm concerned. It's very George Orwell's 1984, a book I've read no less than 20 times. It is my favorite book of all time, and for this very reason.
It should be.
And it scares me. It really scares me. When you compare it against Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and you see these juxtaposition between those two concepts, where one was driven by fear and control, and the other one was, manipulation by luxury and by temptation. Then it's like we've hit that point now, and we've got both. Because all the technology is there and all the reward systems are there, and we live in the most resource-blessed period of human existence. And to that end, it's both simultaneously. And I get I get this little like red flag pop up in the back of my head when I hear people say, you can't say that, or you're not allowed to say that, or you're not allowed, or worse yet, you're not allowed to ask that. That's when we're really starting to tread into that territory, particularly the George Orwell's thought crime territory is very, very dangerous. Any question should be able to be asked, and the data scientist, I imagine, would be in that space. It's like, we've got to ask the question. How we answer it is a totally different problem altogether, but the question should always be reasonably asked if there is a concern. But some people do not have the maturity, or they don't have the foundational systems in their mind to be able to take on the impact of very terrifying prospects about what they might have believed yesterday to be true and might have been on top of a soapbox yelling at people, might in fact be untrue. And now they might have to go back and apologize or, alter their message to some degree. And that's a terrifying prospect. They'll double down, man. I'll double
You do
down.
realize that 1984 was satire, right?
I do.
And yet we are living in those times to some extent. So this is a very weird timeline.
Yes, I do know. Yes.
Uh,
But it also, since when has fiction ever been any weirder than non-fiction? I frankly, I think the lines have blurred so much now that they're one and the same.
One of the core tenets of fiction, like why I like science fiction. Science fiction says less about the future and more about how we currently look at the future. Fiction is a way to address reality without all the constraints of reality.
Yeah, good way, good frame.
Like I'm gonna go on a terrible. I'm gonna mention Soviet Russia here, which, for all its flaws, many of them, limitations breed creativity because you were not allowed to write about a whole bunch of topics. People wrote fiction about similar topics, and not just in Soviet Russia. I'm going to mention
the Gulag Archipelago.
Animal Farm was about totalitarian regimes, just with pigs and animals and such. But because of fiction, we could address issues like basically race wars. Animal Farm was also about race wars. God.
Yeah.
But because it was through the metaphor of fiction, we could address these issues that we would not, for whatever ethical or societal or whatever reasons, could not in reality address. Music is another example of that. You know that much of modern American country music actually stems from black blues jazz music, just with snares instruments instead of trumpets. That in itself, playing, if I may call it like that, black music on white radios where music was just banned, was a form of protest through the metaphor of fiction, of changing it. And I think that is a very powerful thing. That is a force of, what's the word, emancipation, basically.
Yes.
In the old-fashioned way,
It's no different.
And that is lost. That is lost the moment we start banning everything. If we can't have metaphors for political movements featuring, I don't know, Peppa the Pig or something, then we are lost as a society because we will no longer have memes.
I think memes will be the last thing that goes, frankly. I think they're here to stay. They'll definitely outlast you and I. You mentioned Soviet Russia, and I'm keen to segue to some extent into that space, dare I. And I think we can actually find a way to bridge these two topics about messaging, about language, about data, and about people. I think we can bridge that, and we can actually, I reckon we can take it straight into that topic reasonably.
You're going to talk about ChatGPT?
No. But I can, because based on our previous conversation.
Sorry, continue.
All right. With regards to the war in Ukraine at the moment, all right, or the war for Ukraine, maybe that's a better way to phrase it. The war for Ukraine. I actually have a question, because I know that you've been intimately involved a lot of which has been behind the scenes, and I'm quite genuinely want to pick your brain on this. To what extent are the Russians, and I know the Russians, it's a very vague term, but the Russian society as a whole, to what extent do they have capacity or the ability to get information about the war for Ukraine? And, to what extent is it distorted propaganda? And is it a case of what we were talking about before? Is it a lack of interest? They just don't care? Is it there is just deep-seated resentment of some description and it's now getting channeled at Ukraine? Like, what is it? How do you see it? Because to my mind, you see these Reddit videos and you can read any article on the Sun, and it's very hard to throw the NATO bias. I actually fought for NATO, so in my mind, I've got a NATO bias, and so I very much try and empathize with my enemy, and the enemy is not necessarily a person here, but a problem. But in this case, there is a pretty targeted enemy. What do the Russian people think? Is there a sway of opinion? Is the messaging getting through to them? What's happening?
I'm gonna approach this from a sociological perspective.
Okay.
The short answer I can give you is yes, everything of the above and then some.
Mm-hmm.
A more elaborate answer actually has to take us back to World War II propaganda, because nowadays we call it media and communication, which was my minor. I studied that, or we call it marketing, which is a big business. But back in the day, we just called it propaganda, which was not a negative thing. Propaganda from Latin just means influence what they say about you. Back then, the big propaganda tactics was in part to just cut off any news from the enemy coming in and just loudly blast your own news. This is in part what Nazi Germany did. It's what the Allies did all the same. Loudly blast your truth and make sure people don't hear the other side. This is why in part we had the post-World War II Germany response of "Wir haben es nicht gewusst," where we did not know, because in part back then information control was simpler. There was no internet, barely radio. So many could claim, or did actually truthfully claim, we did not know the Holocaust was happening, which is no excuse, but I'm just talking about information.
It's context. It's context.
Context, yes. This brings us to Soviet Russia, which is important because Soviet Russia did not exist just during World War II, not during the few years, because in the short term, you have great information control, but in the long term, something always seeps out. There's always somebody with a leak, somebody with a Lady Gaga CD. News will come out. And this is what happened during the Cold War, where at first, Soviet propaganda, of course, said, yeah, the West is decadent and bad, and we have it so much better over here, which in the short term works. North Korea is doing it to this day. But in the long term, more and more news from the opposite side of the wall in Germany seeped in. You could literally look across the wall, see people have better lives, better cars, TVs, whatnot. So in the long term, you couldn't keep up your big lie, because the big lie tactic from Goebbels no longer sufficed. So the Soviets developed a new tactic, which is the fire hose of falsehoods. Rather than selling one lie and making it as big as possible until everyone believes it and you become president, which still works to some extent, they started producing multiple stories, none of which matched with the other, but to just bombard the population with bullshit so they would stop believing the actual truth. And this is what we see repeated to some extent with the modern Russian population in the current war, which is that they are bombarded, and we also see this in the West, because by proxy bots, they also bombard the West with, yeah, but it's actually not really a war. They're brotherly people. Ukraine started it, but it's actually NATO soldiers fighting them, and they're cyborgs, and there's also biolabs. Look this up. It's actually American biolabs with mutant mosquitoes. That is the reason why they invaded, why Russia started the war, but it's also not a war. And also the opponent is Nazis for some reason, even though we are literally locking people in camps and gunning them down and burning them in ditches. None of these stories match up properly. They are all mutually exclusive falsehoods. But because there are so many falsehoods, you train the population, and this is something that has been happening since the age of the Tsars, basically. The population is trained to just stop believing in anything and to just not engage with politics.
That's George Orwell right there.
That's why I'm talking about. That's why Orwell is so important. The Soviets conditioned their own population to just disengage from anything political and just focus on their own lives. And this is the treaty that Putin basically made with his own people. after the fall of the Soviet Union, when he basically bombed and invaded Chechnya Chechnya, sorry, apologies, Chechnya to rise to power, because he quickly became a hero because he was bombing Muslims, which was fucked up. And then he invaded Georgia, and then Ukraine, yada yada. If the population does not engage with what I do abroad, you get to have some freedom, some modernity, because Western cars were entering the place. There was more wealth, more financing. There was a Pizza Hut in Moscow. There was a McDonald's. When the war in Ukraine broke out, there were less people protesting in the streets in Moscow than there were people lining up at the McDonald's
Brilliant.
Okay, I read a report that said that, at least. There were more lines at the McDonald's because people went to the McDonald's for the last time because they knew it would close up again. The point here is that there is this treaty basically with the population. If you let me do my dictator thing, you will have increased living standards. This is very important when we look at China today as well, because Xi Jinping basically has the same treaty deal with the population, which is you let me do whatever I want, sticking every minority in camps, as long as I keep improving your living standards, which he did. But, and here's the but, these regimes topple when they can no longer enforce this deal. When people are no longer able to disengage from the politics because they're literally being dragged off, mobilized and dragged off to war.
Yeah, that's when the fantasy gets broken.
Their entire economy goes down the dumpster, and or in China's case, have approached Western standards and can no longer rise. And you have zero birth rate, and you'll soon, in 20 years, have 1 in 3 people of your population be elderly. We are going to have some very interesting decades ahead of us. Both Russia and China will burn down purely through domestic problems because they won't be able to fuel their economy. They don't have enough babies. It's simple as that. I'm not even doing any judgment ethics thing. It's just measuring. They have no babies today. 20 years time, they won't have any workers, and neither is very eager to have immigrants supply and make up for that labor shortage. Now, back to the original question, because the Russian population has been willfully indoctrinated for decades to not engage with politics, they therefore do not engage with politics when Putin invades another country for his own imperialistic colonial purposes, because this is a modern colonial war.
Yeah, it is. It's almost impossible to remove that aspect out of the narrative from an external perspective.
Because Russia, from the Tsars to the Soviets to today, is really the last colonial empire in human history. The Brits gave up their territories. The French gave up their territories. Us, the Dutch, we gave up our territories way too late, way ashamed of that. Indonesia, I'm so sorry. But we gave up our shit. Russia did not to this day. Now they're trying to reclaim it. So this is a blast from the past. This is a modern colonial war. What the heck is happening? But the population of Russia does not really respond to it because they have been conditioned not to. Because they also didn't do it when Crimea was invaded, because Georgia was invaded, because Chechnya was invaded. And with all due respect, the West didn't really reply to any of those invasions either. So to some extent, we are hypocritical bastards when we say, yeah, Russia, why aren't you resisting and doing something about it? When the last 3-4 times Putin started bombing innocents, we didn't do shit about it either.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. This is not a defense in any way for what the Russian population is doing. I have friends who are Russian, and
we were talking about it before. You said, and you always have to zoom in to higher resolution understanding to get into the complexity of how sophisticated these problems really are. And the reason we're finding out about some of the war crimes is because Russians are the ones pushing it back into Western territory and NATO-led territory. So
thank you for mentioning this. This is an important part. Last week, heartbreaking interviews were released by ex-Wagner mercenaries, talking about how they shot 20 kids in a ditch and burned for 400 people. All kinds of war crimes. Kids are being murdered. This is Nazi level shit. But these interviews were released by Gulagu.net, a Russian human rights organization. We actually know about these crimes of the Putin regime thanks to Russian operatives. These interviews also, for the first freaking time, mention there were Russian soldiers who refused to shoot unarmed civilians, who refused to gun down Ukrainians. They were shot too and dumped in the same ditch, which makes the war crimes all the more worse. But this is also in a terrible way, because it's all terrible, don't get me wrong. Look, there's Russians resisting, and they are actually helping out. But these are completely different from the controlled opposition, the far right opposition that is the mainstream opposition in Russia, which Navalny in part represents. Because yes, they oppose Putin because they think he's not enough of a murderous bastard.
He's not a tyrant enough. He could be more.
Yeah. They literally call for nukes and call for more invasions. And this brings us back to the Cold War era, with us going, should we fund any opposition? No, I don't think we should fund any opposition, because some of that opposition might actually be worse. But this takes us all the way back to the original question: what's going on over there? Some are resisting. Many have fled the country. I have friends, a couple. He is Russian. He's from St. Petersburg, I believe. She is Ukrainian. They are the strongest couple in the world that I have ever known. I have such utmost respect for their love, because they are stuck on either side of the war, and they raise funds together to buy drones for the Ukraine army.
Wow, look at that! And so it's to bridge into back into the old topic about messaging. I think one of the dangers, and it's a very simplistic and human danger, is the all-encompassing language. Russians, Americans. It's like the world is so complex at this stage that every problem is broken down into 1,000 sub-problems. And I think it's like a game of variables and tolerances more than it is about, on, off, black, white, whatever binary path you want to choose. And so, to my mind, I wonder to what extent the tolerances are shifting, because, as you said, the living standards have dropped, the populations are decreasing, the prospect of being conscripted, and let's be honest, if my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the data that I'm using is incorrect, there are more women than men in Russia by a pretty reasonable standard. And the taking of a marriageable age men and throwing them onto the meat grinder that is the war front might not be the best strategic strategy.
No, it is a ticking time bomb. In the long term, the nation is demographically done for. There's actually ads right now on Russia Today. Sometimes I feel like watching comedy, so I look at Russia Today. For dating apps to go date Chinese men, because they have a women's surplus and China has a men's surplus. And this could theoretically be a match made in heaven, if not for the wide cultural differences and the two dictatorial regimes. But I think an important point
wacky
here.
World. It's just bizarre.
This is state obligated. Go marry that person and make babies. They reintroduced the Soviet hero of the motherland award for mothers who have like 10 babies and
it's a stuff. Classic. That one comes out when times are really good.
Yeah. So this is all happening, but I want to mention language here. Mm-hmm. Because the core offense and all the bias and all the diversity, all these topics we just mentioned, language is a huge part of that. And many I get comments these days also because I have like a bot network following me and occasionally trying to ban me by mass reporting my posts. So I lost my LinkedIn account before, and I think I just feel very validated and very important when there's Russian bots trying to take me down. Means I'm actually doing something.
You're annoying enough.
If nobody's getting angry at you, then you're not really saying anything. I truly do believe that.
That's a Jordan Peterson classic.
Language is because they often mass report me and other people, some of who are banned right now, important voices from, for example, Ukraine, for saying nasty things about Russia, specifically about Russians, which I can understand when they're literally killing your people.
When they're being genocidal, yes.
Which we consider offensive today, because you can't talk about an ethnicity like that. But here, language is important, because in Ukrainian, they do not say Russian. They say Moscovi. They say Muscovites, people from Moscow. Because, and this is important, Russia isn't really a federation. It is Moscow, which is the colonial empire capital, and its colonies. Chechnya, Dagestan, Tatarstan, Kazakhstan up till a short while ago. Georgia and Ukraine and Poland managed to get out, God bless. So it is not really a state or a nation. It is the colonial empire of Moscow. And in Ukrainian, they do not shit talk Russians. They shit talk Moscow. This is why in my language, in my writing, I mainly switched to criticizing Moscow, because I don't really bear ill will to Russians in general. Many of them live in colonies in third world situations without toilets.
They're also at the hand of a tyrant.
Yeah, and now they're being rounded up and stuffed into vans to go die to gunfire. They are in a way victims too. But, and here's the most important thing, because I've worked for years with refugees. I did research on that. I have a shit ton of stories about Syria. I have friends in Iran, all over Africa, where Wagner, Russia's military branch mercenaries, are also operative. They all suffer under Moscow's colonial ambitions, same as the Russians who live in the colonial territories. So what is the best possible thing that could happen to any of them? To the people in Syria, who are bombed by Assad using Moscow's weapons. To the people of Iran, who are oppressed by the religious leadership, who get money from Moscow. They would all benefit from Moscow's fall. They would not benefit from the West appeasing Moscow and calling for peace and negotiations. And Zelensky, how about you just give up, I don't know, part of your territory? It's like, because they speak that language. The Netherlands could totally annex Belgium. They speak our language. Doesn't make it right. It's utter bullshit. The world at large, and this is way bigger than just Ukraine, Syria, Iran, so many places in Africa would all benefit from the fall of Moscow. Even the people in Russia themselves, the vast majority who are living under colonial rule, would benefit from Putin's fall. And this is why I write so much about this topic. This is why I lobby, why I do speaking about it, why I help raise funds. Because this would not just help Ukraine, this would help the world at large. Because Putin is the second biggest threat we have to a free world right now.
Mm-hmm.
And no amount of appeasement would change that.
So what do you, if you I mean, your finger's been right on the pulse on this whole crisis. It is a crisis, but it's a war. It's also and everything in between.
Language, it's a lot of words.
Yeah, they mean different things and they have different implications. But to what extent do you think the next steps are? There's talk of a new offensive. I don't see the Ukrainians sitting idle in their defensive positions. I think they're going to get ready for another hook I'd love to see what that looks like. What's the from your understanding, what's the morale like within the Ukrainian forces at the moment? Are they still chomping at the bit? Are they starting to get worn down now, or they still got as much fight as they ever had?
First of all, I am not a military expert. I am good at getting data from weird places to explain what is happening, but I am not the tactical guy. From what I can see, there has been a huge meat grind called Bakhmut, which was just the very front line, and Russia 9 months ago said we will take the city. So they just keep sending
it's called attrition. It's just a war of attrition.
Meat grinder, which from Ukraine perspective is like the best thing ever, because it means they can just keep grinding in one place and keep the rest of the countryside relatively safe. Because in the end, they are doing this to keep their country safe. Now, they received fancy new tanks from the West. We could have sent more. We should be sending a whole lot more. We should be sending F-16s and airplanes too, because they are currently... It's not about the strongest link in your chain. It's about the weakest link in your chain. And air power is what they still lack the most in ammunition. There's mud everywhere right now, which tanks do not function real well with mud tracks like that. It's nasty stuff. So as soon
as... The
heavy
ones in particular, the big ones, the main battle tanks will really struggle.
And they got really big tanks now. Yeah. And they're placing contact one Soviet reactive armor all over that. So once the mud dries up, there will likely be a spring offensive intent to cut off the land bridge to Crimea at some point. And they're very proposedly keeping the Russians guessing which part of that land bridge they're going to cut off. Why? Because in the end, this whole war is about Crimea, which contains Sevastopol, which is the biggest port of the Black Sea, which is where the Russian Navy, or what's left of it, resides. They've been renting that from Ukraine since Soviet times. The whole 2013-14 Maidan revolution was in part a response to Ukraine saying, "No, Russia, we no longer want your whole fleet in our harbor." To which Russia said, "Well, screw you! I'm gonna put another conflict in place."
Yeah,
that's part of the reason the whole conflict started. And this is also important, because this is not just a war. This is a war to run a war to enable more war. Because without Sevastopol, without the Black Sea port, Russia does not have a proper navy, and they need a proper navy to fuel more war. Now, this is why in 2014 they just took Crimea, which they deny to this day, and we let it happen. So yes, the West is responsible for this as well, in part. Not Russia is, of course, the main aggressor, but we are responsible by
it's sin by omission.
Thank you. That's the word in English. Sin by omission, because we didn't do shit about it except express our concerns or whatever.
Russia, sin by commission. NATO, sin by omission.
Yeah, it's still early over here. So then they built that bridge, the Crimean Bridge, which was built blown up half a year ago and now slightly repaired, because they did not have any landline access to Crimea. This is also why the land that they've taken from Ukraine now and have not retreated from is actually a land bridge, because this whole invasion, they're mainly after establishing a land bridge to Crimea to continue to supply their port, to continue to supply their navy, which is why it's of utmost importance to cut off those supply lines, because the moment the spring offensive cuts off the land bridge and gets within range of the bridge again to blow it up again, then it's just a defensive waiting game, and basically wait for Crimea to starve, sort of, in the southern part of Kherson over there. And then it's done deal, because Russia had a winter offensive this winter. Did you hear of it?
You just basically siege it.
No, they had a big winter offensive, but nobody heard about it because it failed completely. Because
the Crimea land bridge bit. If you cut it off at the land bridge and then you cut the other bridge off, you're sieging Crimea essentially. And just wait.
Exactly, and then you play the waiting game. Then you just siege them until they have no more ammo left because Russia is already running out of tanks and ammunition and everything. Poland has more tanks than Russia by now. And the Russian and the Polish friends I know are just like waiting for, come on, bro, just get on with it.
There's a lot of animosity there.
Our outfits and everything, they're waiting. But the whole point here is after the land bridge is cut off through a spring offensive, fingers crossed, it would become a waiting game because Russia no longer has the military potential to go on the offensive. They can only fight a defensive war, which is why it's so important for us to supply Ukraine with everything to do that offensive, which is why now Russia is once again screaming, Moscow, I should say, saying, yeah, we should do peace talks and blah, blah, because now they're driven into a corner. So now they want to negotiate. But yeah, once Crimea falls, which would then only be a matter of time, they lose the seaport. They can no longer use launch cruise missiles from there to bombard civilians or, I don't know, Moldova. Then it would be a tick-tock moment because Putin can justify losing land in this new colonial invasion, but he will likely not survive, hopefully not survive the loss of face from losing a colony he took.
Russia has a history, mate. Leaders go on a cycle, and he's a couple of years overdue.
And then the question becomes who's the next warlord, because there will likely be a warlord stage where Prigozhin, the boss of Wagner, and Shoigu and stuff will all try to move in and be the next Putin. It's not a job I would like to have. Nope. Hopefully the colonial empire of Moscow breaks up at that point and we get the Tatars, the Dagestanis, the Kariros being overthrown, hopefully, the Buryats, who are basically a Mongol people stuck over there, would all form their own republics and actually be free for once. And then it would be up to us, the West, to do Marshall Plan style aid. I pray that we will, to guide them to, become modernized, happy, democratic Western countries, come join the club, rather than letting them just burn and wait for another warlord to arise. I think that would be a shame. But that is a big post-war threat that we
in the short term, we've got to win the battles. We've got to win these meat grinder battles.
But you don't want to just win the war and then retreat and wait for more radicals to take over.
Always a vacuum.
That happen in the East. That would be such a shame.
Always a vacuum. There's always a vacuum when that happens. Marjan, I love our chats.
I'm sorry for the rant near the end. That was more than expected.
Mate, I love it. Frankly, I think it's always a blessing to be able to get a dialogue with someone of your intelligence and experience and candor as well. So thank you very much, mate. The pleasure is always on my end. And I am really glad to see you growing at the rate that you are on the platforms that you support. You're doing all the right things for all the right reasons, and where I can, I try and throw my weight behind it because I know you're doing some amazing work. Thank you very much for what you're doing. Keep up the good work, and at least for mine, thanks again for a chat on my evening, your morning. P.S. It's a really cool mug you've got there.
Yeah, I can't officially say it, but NAFO takes me back to the good old anonymous days of random internet morons doing stuff that actually changes the world, and I've missed that in my life for like a decade, and I'm back. So I'm a happy little shit posting boy. Thank you so much for having me. I loved our chat. I promise next time we will talk about change management.
Oh yeah. Don't worry, man.
I've got more AI ChatGPT stuff because everyone just keeps talking about that, and they forget that Microsoft Tay, the Twitter Nazi chatbot of 2016, was also a large language model, just like ChatGPT. The same people who now scream about it being good back then screamed it was bad. So that's all hype cycle again. But we already talked about hype cycles. Thank you so much. Like and subscribe. That's how you do this, right?
Cheers, man. Safe travels.
Cheers.